Hello, everybody. My name is Paul Rose. I'm currently an undergraduate senior here at Colorado State University studying music with a minor in business administration. I'm originally from Pueblo, Colorado, a town with a large Hispanic population, but also a large white population. My dad is white and my mom is Filipino, so growing up, I was surrounded by a large Asian American community. And a lot of the values that I have today, I gained from that community. But going to school, I was taught solely white values. For example, at home with my mom, we ate with our hands, but at school, you ate with a spoon and a fork because eating with your hands was considered dirty. At friendly family gatherings, everybody talked loud and excitedly and over each other, but at school, you talked with your hand raised, only when you were called on. At home, I grew up around fast sentences and broken grammar, but at school, you talked slow and concise, grammatically correct sentences, or else nobody would be able to understand you. At school, I learned that my half-Asian side was for existing at home, and my half-white side was for existing in society. As I continued through the education program, music became a really big focus of mine. And in first grade, my sister and I begged our parents to get us a guitar, and that year for Christmas they did. So in second grade, I started taking guitar lessons. But it wasn't until fifth grade when I would truly find my love for music, when I auditioned for the school musical Beauty and the Beast and got one of the star roles. Ever since then, I took every opportunity I could to take a music class: guitar, piano, music theory, music history, choir. If it had music in the name, I was there. But as I started taking these music classes, I realized how repetitive some of the information became. As new classes came, material got harder, but at its core, we were still learning about the same composers, compositions, styles, genres, over and over and over again. I'm going to play some of those for you, and maybe you'll recognize them too. Perhaps you're a fan of Beethoven and his large dramatic works, like that in Moonlight Sonata. Maybe you're more familiar with his arguably more recognizable piece, Feliz. Not a fan of Beethoven? Maybe you are of one of the greats, one of the untouchables, like Bach and his Prelude, which has been used in countless TV shows and movies. Or maybe you're more of a fan of the lyrical dramatic works like Brahms and his Walton A-flat. Or maybe you're just not a fan of classical music, but like me, were caught up in the craze of Squid Games last year. Well, in Squid Games, they used their own version of Johann Strauss's The Beautiful Blue Danube. Now, I didn't understand why at the time we kept learning about the same topics, but I did realize one thing. None of the composers up there looked like me. None of them shared my Asian identity, my gay identity. But as I continued throughout high school, music became one of the main focuses of mine. And because of the really great music instructors and program that I was blessed to grow up in, it inspired me to come to college for it. Well, when I got to CSU, my point of view was expanded widely beyond what I brought up believing. For the first couple of semesters, I was able to take ethnic studies classes, and for the first time, I learned about the colonized mindset I had and the harm that it could have on others and myself. And truly, for the first time, I realized the lack of diversity in my education, not only in high school, but the one I was getting in college as well. And so I continued these music classes, music theory, music history, and still we were learning about the same composers, the same compositions. Where were the composers who looked like me? Where were the composers who identified like me? Why was every person that I was learning about a white man? A white man. A white man. There had to be more out there. And so I started to question my professors. Where were these composers? And so that's when I started to do more research into how we teach music. In the United States, we teach from something called the Western musical canon. Now, this isn't a set group of people who get together every year to decide what we will and will not teach students, but rather the Western musical canon is this naturalized list of composers, of compositions that we do. If you go around the United States today, you'll be hard-pressed to find textbooks or curriculums that stray from this. So then what's on the canon? Well, what you have to understand about it is that it's constantly contested. What's on the canon? Who's on the canon? If another composer does something better than a past composer, should they replace them on the canon, or should they both be on there? All of these are questions that scholars are contesting. But for the most part, the canon is made up of composers and compositions that we consider to be the top of their genre. For example, Bach is on the canon for the work of his fugue. When we think of a musical fugue, we point to Bach and his near perfection of it. Piano etudes and sonatas were written by the likes of Chopin, and when we listen to piano etudes and sonatas, we think of Chopin. The modern-day symphony would be nothing without Haydn. He created what the symphony was, what it sounded like, the structure of it, which created room for other composers like Beethoven to come along and build off of it. But the regular programming and performing of these different works was not always the case. Pre-19th century, it was typical that when a composer died, their works did not live on post-mortem. Now, there were some exceptions to this. Musicians who were creating their own compositions and profiting off of their art studied closely the works of composers past, but they were only exposing audiences to their pieces, and so audiences were only listening to works of their contemporaries. By the end of the 19th century, though, this changed as there was a larger emphasis on old music. Concert halls and music venues started programming music that hadn't been played in decades, and all of the audiences were able to get more access to the older music, to the older European music, to the older white European music, and that contributed to the canon. Now, specifically in the United States, music education was not always easily accepted. The first music educators had to persuade people to allow them to teach music education, and they were able to because they argued that it taught distinctly American values like sympathy, like benevolence, American values like self-governance. Now, this was all taking place during the Enlightenment period, and these Enlightenment liberal ideas inspired the way that we taught music. The thought was that knowledge, in the end, comes out of instruction. Vocal music was actually the first type of music instruction here in the United States. Now, these vocal pedagogical teaching utilized hymns and Protestant music to drive the way that they were delivering instruction. And many years later, when the curriculum would come around, specifically starting in Boston, they took inspiration from the Protestant, white-centric ways of teaching music in the way that they delivered music instruction. Now, this music canon has to also be distincted into low and high art forms. Low art forms are what we would think of as street ballads and tavern songs, whereas high art forms are more classy, more civilized, more distinctly European. Now, this musical canon has a lot of really wide implications, especially when we're talking about the malleable mind that we're teaching it to. The reality is that many students, especially those with minoritized identities, feel estranged from the teaching of the canon, and this shows up in the students who are pursuing it in college, who are pursuing it as a career. According to the League of American Orchestras, only 7.5% of conductors in the United States are Hispanic or Latino, the largest non-white demographic. 7% of them are Asian. 79%, however, are white. 90.8% of music directors in the United States are male, and 92.2% of orchestral board members in the US today are white. But the sad fact is that we already know this. Music educators, music institutions are already aware that these problems exist, and yet they continue to perpetuate the system. Now, this is not to call all music educators and institutions as racist, but rather part of a system that is incredibly hard to break from. But what makes it so difficult to break from that? Well, I propose that we take an economic viewpoint, specifically that of W.E.B. Du Bois. Du Bois, one of the greatest philosophers, has a quote that says, "I have been brought up with the democratic idea that the object of democratic action in the state, allowing the governed a voice in government. But I realized that we did not have democracy, we had oligarchy, and oligarchy based on monopoly and income." This quote really struck me and inspired me to give this speech to you all today. Du Bois argued that most Black Americans fell into this proletariat working class. And by falling into this proletariat working class, they were making contributions to American society, economic contributions to American society, through their Black art, Black labor, Black music. They were making all of these significant contributions to build up a white America that built up white Americans. But a lot of the contributions that they were making were being pushed aside, and I'd argue that that reaches to most minorities today and their economic contributions, who's been pushed aside and forgotten. And because of that, it's opening up room for naturalized biases to occur. And by naturalized biases, I mean biases that are so interwoven into our minds and our society that when we see them, when we hear them, when we do them, we don't even give them a second thought. Take, for example, the case of Marian Anderson. Marian Anderson was the first Black opera singer on the Metropolitan Opera, but that took until 1955 to happen. Now, although there are multiple studies that refute that Black bodies are different from white bodies, that Black vocal folds are different from white vocal folds, her voice was continuously labeled as distinctly Black sounding. Adjectives such as unique or thrilling with the weight of sorrow were used to perpetuate this false but naturalized bias that Black voices were any different than white. And because of that, it kept her and her contemporaries out of this highest art form that we call opera. Still today, we are seeing Black singers being kept out of the highest art forms. Still today, we are seeing institutions that keep out minorities being held up. Whether we're talking about the way the music industry treats people of color, whether we're talking about the way names being left out of history, whether we're talking about white people taking credit for minority accomplishments. Music education was built up because of these Enlightenment liberal ideas, and because of that, we have been teaching from a white-centric Western musical canon. And when we are solely basing our education off of this white Western musical canon, whether intentional or not, we are telling kids, here's how music should function. Here's how you should understand it. Here's how you should listen to it. We are telling them that here is how a bunch of old dead white dudes did music, and if you don't do it that way too, then you're doing it wrong. We are telling them that to exist in the musical education world, you have to conform to the white standard to be there. Music education was built up in a way that the white man always comes out on top. And still today, we are teaching music education in a way that the white man comes out on top. And these economic holds are part of the reason that we have stayed there, but also should be the driving force for change. So what if? What if one day we decide to do away with the musical canon and teach one that is as diverse as we are as a people? Well, first and foremost, as dated as the canon is, canons do serve a purpose when we're talking about equity in education and equal access in education. So, I'm proposing that we teach something called the inclusive musical canon. Now, first, I'm not saying that we need to stop teaching about all of these old dead white dudes. They serve their purpose and are integral in our understanding of music today. But I am saying that we need to start including the minoritized voices that have been forgotten. Instead of just teaching about Gabrielli, one of the several Italian Baroque composers that we teach about, let's include Francisco López Capillas in the conversation, one of the leading Mexican Baroque composers integral in the Mexican Mass. Instead of just teaching about the ways that Spain music evolved in European Spain, we need to also talk about the way that the colonization of Spain and the Philippines changed the way they do tribal music. Instead of just teaching about white people, we need to also be teaching about other minoritized voices. Teach about the ways that chant is used in Tibetan monk culture and their religious connotations of it, instead of just teaching about Gregorian chant. Additionally, we also need to be teaching music that kids can get excited about and listen to and learn about. Teach about the ways that Taylor Swift and Beyoncé and Ariana Grande use music theory in their own compositions. Teach about the ways that hip-hop is a distinctly black art form that comes from other distinctly black art forms. Teach music in a way so that the gay Asian kid from Pueblo, Colorado can look up on the screen and say, that's me up there, and that's what I want to do. Thank you.